Good evening. Getting serious about it now. Well, tonight we get to resume our study of Nehemiah. And I have to say that the more I study Nehemiah and the more I read and think about it, the more I'm impressed with Nehemiah. When you really spend a little time and look at the type of man Nehemiah was, it's hard not to come away very impressed. And we're going to look in fairly close detail about some events that transpired and how Nehemiah handled them. And by way of review, I'd like to go over a couple things in chapter 5 before we get to where we're going to actually be starting in chapter 5, verse 14. In the first part of chapter 5, we find that wealthy Jews were loaning money to their brethren at exorbitant rates, and then when they couldn't make the payments, they were foreclosing and taking their land. And when Nehemiah heard about that, verse 6 says he was very angry. Now, I'd like to see a show of hands. If you've ever been very angry, raise your hand. I think that's pretty much all of us. And I want to look at how Nehemiah handled that briefly. Verse 7 in the English Standard Version said he had a conversation with himself. Now, I've been chuckling about that for about 3 weeks now when I first read that. I heard a joke one time that there were two men walking down the road, and one of the men was talking to himself. The other one looks over and says, "Hey, are you talking to yourself?" He looks back and he says, "Yeah, it's the only way I can guarantee myself an intelligent conversation." Nehemiah took counsel with himself. The King James Version says he seriously considered it. He gave it some serious thought. Now, going back to my earlier question, when you were very, very angry, and I would assume it was either at someone or a certain situation that might have developed in your life, did you stop and give it serious thought before you reacted? Hopefully some of us did, but I'm afraid most of us probably didn't.
Turned around and walked away.
Well, that's probably one of the very best.
I was going to hit him if I didn't.
I debated on whether I was going to mention this, but don't raise your hands. But how many of you have ever had a serious or been seriously angry with your spouse? I said don't raise your hands. I don't want to start something. I can recall my mom and dad were married close to 65 years, and I had just a wondrous marriage. But I can recall a time or two dear old dad said something that my mother never forgot. And unfortunately, I've been married 35 years. That's not the unfortunate part, but I've been married 35 years, going on 36. And I might have said something every now and then in anger that my lovely wife hasn't forgot either. My point is, Nehemiah thought about his response. He didn't react in anger. He didn't lash out. He thought about his response, and he basically told these people that they were in the wrong. And what'd they do? They agreed with him. They said okay, and they swore to do better, and as far as we know, they did. I thought about that a lot whenever I was pondering the lesson, and there are some incredible applications for us as Christians. I looked up the different verses that have mentioned the tongue in the Bible, and there are far too many to even begin to discuss tonight. But there's quite a few of them that reference the tongue as a two-edged sword. And I think about how in moments of anger or even careless moments, we can say things to each other that cause problems that reverberate through the years. And so I would caution each of us to follow Nehemiah's example and to think about, to have a conversation with ourselves if necessary before we respond anytime we feel ourselves becoming seriously angry. Any thoughts before we move on? Well, let's go ahead and look at verse 14. We're going to be reading verses 14 through 16. Moreover, from the time that I was appointed to be their governor in the land of Judah, from the 20th year until the 32nd year of Artaxerxes, 12 years, neither I nor my brothers ate the governor's provisions. But the former governors who were before me laid burdens on the people and took from them bread and wine, besides 40 shekels of silver. Yes, even their servants bore rule over the people. But I did not do so because of the fear of God. Indeed, I also continued to work on this wall, and we did not buy any land. All my servants were gathered there for the work. Well, what was happening here is that Nehemiah was the governor, and as such had the right to tax the people for his livelihood, for the food for his table and the wages for his servants. And he chose not to do that, which was in stark contrast to the people or the governors that had been there before him. Why do you think Nehemiah chose to do that?
We said because of the fear of the Lord, or because I feared the Lord, and it implies that he knew that God was knowledgeable of what he was doing, and he wanted to please God in the process.
And we know that the people at this time were suffering financially and were under a heavy burden just trying to survive. Up until this pretty much exact point in time, they didn't even have a secure structure to live behind. Their wall was breached, and they were, I'm quite certain, enduring hardships because of that, just in basic survival. So, because Nehemiah feared the Lord, he determined that he would not further burden the people. And another thing that I really thought significant in this was, it says, he continued work on the wall, and the last sentence was, all my servants were gathered there for the work. Well, earlier we learned that the past governors lorded over the people, even their servants did. But here we have Nehemiah, who's apparently working on the wall himself, as well as all of his servants. So he definitely practiced what he preached, didn't he? He was right there with them, along with everybody else, showing the people how important it was to be unified in that endeavor. And that's why they were able to accomplish great things. Any thoughts before we move on?
When Nehemiah was first asked by the king, how long are you going to be away? We don't have any idea how long he told the king. Now, it's 12 years. I don't know if he said, hey, 12 years or a couple of years or whatever, but he's been there for 12 years getting all this work done. That's longer than I thought that he would stay, when you first start reading the book.
You know, when you think about that implies several things. We've talked about how the king must have greatly trusted Nehemiah as his cupbearer. But to give him free reign for 12 years is a long time. It really is. But Scripture tells us that's the length of time that Nehemiah was there. Let's read Nehemiah chapter 5, verses 17 through 18. At my table were 150 Jews and rulers, besides those who came from the nations around us. Now that which was prepared daily was 1 ox and 6 choice sheep. Also fowl were prepared for me, and once every 10 days an abundance of all kinds of wine. Yet in spite of this, I did not demand the governor's provisions, because of the bondage was heavy on the people. This kind of gives you an idea of the scope of Nehemiah's table. And the more I read about that number, this 150, Nehemiah had quite a number of people with him, some of which were individuals that just simply didn't have anything to eat, and so he provided for them. And he did so at his own expense. When, as we discussed, the previous governors had taxed the people and forced them to pay for his upkeep and whatever he chose to do. Let's look at well, before we move on, I want to kind of focus on, because the bondage was heavy on this people sentence. Nehemiah did not take personal advantage of another's needs. He did what every good leader must do, and he never expected more of his followers than he expected of himself. Let's look at the last verse in the chapter, Nehemiah 5, verse 19. Remember me, O God, for good, according to all that I have done for this people. This is Nehemiah praying to God to remember the things that he's done. Now, is this Nehemiah shouting from the top of his new wall that he was a great guy and he was so benevolent and he was doing everything for these people? I don't think so either.
That's even more of a humble statement, very cautiously.
And he was saying it to God. He was in a prayer.
He evidently didn't ever ask the people to do anything that he wouldn't do himself either.
That's exactly right.
It reminds me of when the people asked for a king way back when they had the judges, and God warned them, hey, the king's going to suppress you. He's going to take your kids and they're going to serve him, And I know he's not a king, he's a governor here, but it just makes me feel like, he has full right to do this, obviously, from the Persian Empire and the setup of the system. But, he's chosen not to do that whatsoever, to make those provisions. And really, like you said, he's a man of the people. He is just there with them. And then I love the end of, just like you said, just a little prayer. And all through Nehemiah, it's just little bitty prayers here and there. How many times in the day do we need to do that? Just take a second, How many times do you tell somebody, one will pray for you, and you forget about it? Take that time right when you tell them to pray, just like Nehemiah just takes time immediately to say a short prayer.
Well, and that's another example of what a great person Nehemiah is, and how he was centered on God in everything that he did. And really, when you look at what he accomplished, there's no way he could have done what he did without the Lord's blessing and assistance. He was an incredible person, and he did what he did because he feared God, not so he would be recognized of men. I thought a lot about that. I knew a man very well that did a lot of nice things for people, but he was always able to wring every ounce of public recognition from them. In fact, this particular individual had 4 OU and 4 OSU season tickets. And he told me one time, he said, I offer those tickets to people that I know can't go. So I can offer them to as many as possible and get all the benefit from that. I thought, I still scratch my head over that one.
We had a man that lived in Cyprus, a millionaire. And every once in a while, I was on the Dodger Fire Department, and every once in a while, when we'd have a fundraiser, they always asked me to go to him because he turned a lot of them down. But the first time I went to him, I told him what we were doing, what we was going to do with the money, and that if he would give something. And he said, yes, I'll donate if you make sure my name is put in the paper.
Well, this same individual, who shall remain nameless, I went to a funeral where he worshiped, and on the podium it was said donated. There was a plaque that said donated by so-and-so on the podium.
Stacy, don't you think for all that Nehemiah did, I mean, telling them you're oppressing the poor, not taking the food, the allowance, you know, basically donating. I mean, who wouldn't want to work for this man? Who wouldn't want to get up there and build this wall and be part of him? I mean, I can't see anybody, you know, and to me, that's such a good lesson for us. You know, if we're down in the dirt doing the work, you know, people are just going to appreciate that and want to be part of it.
I think that's an excellent point, Todd, and that's what he was doing. He was right there working on that wall with everybody else. I want to briefly look at Matthew chapter 6, verses 1 through 4. It says, take heed that you do not do your charitable deeds before men to be seen by them. Otherwise you have no reward from your Father in heaven. Therefore, when you do a charitable deed, do not sound a trumpet before you as the hypocrites do in the synagogue and in the streets, that they may have glory from men. Assuredly, I say to you, they have their reward. But when you do a charitable deed, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, that your charitable deed may be in secret, and your Father who sees in secret will himself reward you openly. I think Nehemiah adhered to that principle completely, and I think it shows in the fact, as Todd mentioned, that all of these people were excited about working with him and working together in one body to accomplish one major goal. Any comments before we start chapter 6? For such a good guy, there were so many people after Nehemiah. It's kind of amazing. And perhaps John can help us out here. I don't know. I tried to do some research to figure out what year the children of Israel crossed the Jordan River into the land of Canaan. And I got several different answers off the internet, once again. Anywhere from 1250 BC to 1407 BC. I don't really know. But I think it's curious to me anyway, why these people, Sanballat, Tobiah, and Geshem, were so terrified of the Israelites and terrified of them completing the wall. And I had to wonder if it's because when the Israelites rolled through the land of Canaan, they crushed so many of these countries, and I don't know if that memory still lingered, or if it was just they were concerned about a neighbor gaining military strength. I don't know. But there's no question that Sanballat and Tobiah and Geshem, from what I understand, were three leaders of different countries that had been basically overcome by the Persian Empire, and they were governors for Artaxerxes. At any rate, let's look at...
The Daily Bible has crossing the Jordan, or about 1446 BC.
Okay.
Is that right, that if Saul ruled starting about 1,000, we have 350 years of the judges, and then 40 years of Joshua's life, 1,400 plus a little bit.
Well, that's semi-close to what I saw. 1407 was one answer that I saw, which is still a pretty good chunk of time from then until our discussion in Nehemiah. I don't know if they would have still remembered or if it was just a current situation. It really is not that relevant. We just know they did. It did harbor ill feelings toward Nehemiah. Verse 1 through 4. Now it happened when Sanballat, Tobiah, Geshem the Arab, and the rest of our enemies heard that I had rebuilt the wall and that there were no breaks left in it, though at the time I had not hung the doors and the gates, that Sanballat and Geshem said to me, saying, Come, let us meet together among the villages in the plains of Ono. But they thought to do me harm, so I sent messengers to them, saying, I am doing a great work, so I cannot come down. Why should the work cease while I leave it and go down to you? But they sent me this message 4 times, and I answered them in the same manner. The commentary I looked at, the Burton commentary, talked about this particular place they were trying to draw him to being 12 to 19 miles north of Jerusalem, and that in their perception, they thought it would be somewhat of a vacation or a luxurious place for him to go. Possibly, they thought, he would think, to reconcile with them and to have maybe a political meeting that might benefit them. Well, did he buy that?
Oh, no.
No. This man was incredibly insightful. He absolutely did not, he didn't bite, so to speak. When the enemies surrounding them heard that the wall was being rebuilt, they tried everything to stop him or stop them from getting that done. And, you know, as we talked about in several earlier chapters, they ridiculed him. Nehemiah 4, verses 1 through 6. They threatened military action, chapter 4, verses 7 through 23. And now they're trying to lure him away with evil intent. But Nehemiah, in his wisdom, basically said no. And not only did he say no, he said, well, why should I go while we're doing a great work building the wall? And I'm sure that didn't make him any too happy, because that's exactly what they were trying to stop. I think it's fairly obvious that they were reluctant to take military action against him, because Nehemiah had a letter from the king allowing him not only to build the wall, but to draw on resources from the king's forest and other places to accomplish that.
sometimes we don't understand the full impact of the Samaritan woman. Why it was so interesting that Jesus had spoken with her being a woman and a Samaritan. But you go back to Ezra, the Samaritans were trying to ask you to help build a temple, and Zerubbabel said, no, you're not to help us. And then we go 13 years now, and we've got Tobiah and Sanballat trying to frustrate, conspire, and do all these other things. So you kind of get a backdrop to really the friction between the Samaritans, and we know about all the other stuff, but it just re-solidifies why there's so much adversity between the two of them.
The history is really fascinating when you look at it, and it unfolds over a really long period of time in some instances. Any other thoughts?
I think it's funny that they can't get them to come to them so that they can get them. So they run this disinformation campaign against them. So much of like what's going on today. I mean, it's just warfare. It's mental warfare.
Well, and when you get right down to it, we're fixing to talk about politics. Because what they try after this is just flat out political. I'm going to stop there about the politics. The study guide I looked at talks a great deal about Nehemiah's ability to discern what these people are trying to do and see through it. And it also talks about the subtlety of the devil. The scripture tells us that the devil is like a roaring lion seeking whom he may devour. But he doesn't like walk up and knock you on the head and say, okay, Stacy, get ready because I'm about to tempt you. Or I'm about to try to ensnare you in something. Sometimes he's very subtle. Yes, ma'am.
And he can use other people to do it for him.
That's true.
Doesn't have to be just him.
And as a Christian, we have to evaluate every situation, every decision that we make. I remember when my children were growing up, I tried to preach to them that every decision you make has ramifications. Some are small and some are enormous. And sometimes you really can't tell which one is which at the time you're making them. So you have to be very careful and think about what you do. You have to take counsel with yourself from time to time. Okay. Let's look at Nehemiah chapter 6, verses 5 through 9. I'm about to run out of time. Then Sanballat sent his servant to me as before the 5th time, with an open letter in his hand. In it was written, "It is reported among the nations," and Geshem says, "that you and the Jews plan to rebel. Therefore, according to these rumors, you are rebuilding the wall, that you may be their king, and you have also appointed prophets to proclaim you at Jerusalem, saying, there is a king in Judah. Now these matters will be reported to the king, so come, therefore let us consult together. Then I sent to him, saying, no such things as you say are being done, but you invent them in your own heart. For they are all trying to make us afraid, saying, their hands will be weakened in the work, and it will not be done. Therefore, O God, strengthen my hands." Now, the first part of this is very interesting when it says, well, number one, that this was the 5th time. This guy's not real bright, is he? After he rebuffed him 4 times, he took a little different tactic, because that phrase, with an open letter in his hand, the commentary was very insightful, the Burton commentary, and it said what that meant was the letter was open. So every courier that had touched that, from the time it left Sanballat's hand until the time it got to Nehemiah's hand, had read it. So it's just like Rena was saying, they were mounting a disinformation campaign. Gossip. Just like we read about today from time to time.
You get your people turning against each other, you don't have to devour them. You get his own people to do it for you. So that
Well,
was his ambition.
that's exactly right. And boy, we're really going to talk about that probably next week, because I'm out of time. But once again, I just find it fascinating that this Sanballat couldn't convince Nehemiah to come, and so now he sends him a letter that he wants everybody else to read, and word to circulate that Nehemiah, now that he's built this wall, is trying to set himself up as king. And the part about had to be particularly frustrating Nehemiah when it said he was trying to basically get prophets in Jerusalem to proclaim him king. And Nehemiah was quick to put that down and wholeheartedly denied. I wonder if he sent his response back in an open letter. I would like to think maybe he did. The fact that, and the commentary basically said that would have been a grave insult to send a governor an open letter that everyone could have read in the process of it getting to where it was supposed to be. So it's fairly obvious that Sanballat, he didn't really write the letter for Nehemiah's benefit. He wrote it for the people's and tried to persuade them to turn against Nehemiah for fear that Nehemiah was trying to set himself up as king. Well, I think we probably better stop. Our time is up. We'll start with Nehemiah chapter 6, verse 10. Thank you very much.